Welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. This is Jay. This is the first part of a two-part conversation with Maryam Kashani on her book, Medina By The Bay, Scenes of Muslim Study and Survival. It's a cool book that weaves Maryam's scholarly ethnographic work with her talents as a filmmaker and a DJ to examine and illuminate various strains of Islam in the San Francisco Bay Area and Turtle Island more broadly, from the Black Power movement to the so-called War on Terror and the rise of the surveillance state. She dubs her approach ethnocinematic. We discuss legacies of anti-imperialist Islam on Turtle Island as well as more assimilative ways of being. We dig into this more in part 2, but we wanted to make sure we get this first part out during Ramadan. Kashani is an associate professor in gender and women's studies and Asian American studies at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and is in the leadership collective of Believers Bailout, a community-led effort to bail out Muslims in pretrial and immigration incarceration towards abolition. We'll include a lengthier bio in the show description. Believers Bailout has a fundraiser to bail out Muslims during Ramadan, which we will link in the show description. We really encourage folks to kick in what they can to support that initiative. The other thing I wanted to make sure to mention is we do talk a little bit about Imam Jamil Al-Amin in this episode and in part 2. As far as I know, he is still trying to get a medical reprieve or an emergency medical transfer as he battles cancer and other health issues. I'm including a couple of links to quick actions you can take to support this revolutionary elder and veteran of SNCC and the Black Panther Party, who has been incarcerated by the U.S. as a political prisoner for the last 25 years. Make sure to take a few moments and support those campaigns as well. And lastly, we have a Samir Amin Accumulation on a World Scale study group for patrons only. It will start Wednesday the 12th of March and run through June. I'll include a link with more details in the show description, but space is limited on that, so if you want to reserve a spot, make sure to sign up today at patreon.com/millennialsarekillingcapitalism, which is also the best place to support our work on this podcast. Now, here's the first part of my conversation with Maryam Kashani. All right, so Maryam, would you just start by introducing yourself to our audience a bit? I know you're a scholar, you're a filmmaker, you're a DJ as well, and that, you're also part of the leadership collective of Believers Bailout. So that's kind of like a little summary of some things about you, but maybe you could just talk a little bit about how that, comes together or doesn't for you, like how these things relate to each other and how you use these different, kind of mediums that you're involved in and places of study and organizing in kind of your work.
Okay, thank you, Jared, and thank you for inviting me to be on Millennials. It's a real honor. So, Bismillah. Yes, I hold many positions and I wear many hats, and it really happened organically in terms of me following my interests and how I wanted to be in the world. I grew up with a strong musical background, partially because I grew up in a multilingual household where there was no dominant language, and music was really one of the first languages that I felt home in. And as a young person growing up in San Francisco, hip hop really became an important part of my culture and really directed how I oriented myself in the world. When it came time to think about my future studies, I was a little afraid to become like a music producer, which is what I really wanted to do. But I had already, as a teenager, started learning how to DJ, and I was really involved in a kind of hip hop political activism in the Bay Area. I joined like a little bit too late the Universal Zulu Nation's Alafia chapter in San Francisco in the mid-1990s. It soon disbanded, but the folks that I met through that eventually started a group called Underground Railroad. And basically, we were like the cultural workers of the movement that was burgeoning in the 1990s in the San Francisco Bay Area. We were putting on shows and getting, artists to perform at rallies and on marches and just bringing the cultural element to a lot of the organizing that was happening at the time. At the same time, I was starting to get interested in filmmaking, and it really made sense as a place where I could bring together a lot of my different interests, thinking about politics and philosophy, but also experience and thinking about the ways that the place that I grew up, the San Francisco and the larger Bay Area, really impacted how I saw the world and who I was. And then that sort of became a larger theme in my work in terms of the role that public and private histories play in responding to and creating landscapes and geographies. So you can see that in my book as well as in my filmmaking. I'm definitely a child of public transportation. Trains and buses show up in pretty much every one of my films in one way or another. But I also appreciate a drive out into the forests or to the ocean. But yeah, so I think basically how I became like quote unquote like a scholar and a person who teaches in the university, who's positioned there as a worker, actually came from wanting to make a film. I had finished making a documentary, Best in the West, about my father's family and community's emigration from Iran to the US in the 1960s and 70s. And I was looking for a new project. And that's when I heard about this institute called Zaytuna Institute. And this was post 9/11. I was interested in what a New York Times article said about one of the professors or sheikhs or imams of this institute, Imam Zaid Shakir, who features prominently in my book. He was being compared by his students to the late El-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, Malcolm X, sort of like the next Malcolm X. And, coming from my political organizing history and being in a sort of post 9/11 landscape as someone Muslim, but who was never really in Muslim community, I was really interested in what was happening there and thinking about what our lessons were from the 1960s and 70s, because as a child of the Bay Area, I was a child of those histories and had a lot of really wonderful mentors from that time period. And I was like, well, what was missing in that time period? And then also what needs to be known now? What do we need to be thinking about now towards wanting to see the kind of political transformation that our world needed? And spirituality had always been a part of my organizing. Underground Railroad, at our events, we always had altars. We all had different spiritual practices and beliefs that we brought. But for us, it was always really important that we honored our ancestors, those who came before, both blood relations and not. And so that was something that was really important to me. And I think that also emerges in the book, Medina by the Bay. So I think my questions about image making and representation that come from my filmmaking practice really influenced my writing and vice versa. One of my professors at school said that I think visually. And so I really worked hard to bring that into my work and to feel okay about that. And I think across the different work that I do, I haven't been DJing as much as I like. I'm hoping that now that this book is done, I can go back to that. But I think what I've always thought about is the kinds of worlds that we imagine and make when the world isn't made for us, right? And how we create liberated spaces. And also thinking about like the work we do as creative, right? So, and that creativity is material, but it's also spiritual and metaphysical, and how do we make sense and make space out of no place, right? Like these are really like big, I don't know about quantum physics, but I think there's something about that in there. But like, how do we make something? And then how do we remain humble at the same time that we are creating, right? Because creativity is actually like, if you believe in God, right? Like that is the closest perhaps we get to having an understanding of that kind of metaphysics. While at the same time, like in that act of creativity, how do we maintain humility, right? And that's something that comes up in the book where it's one of the first lessons that some of the students learn is like this idea that knowledge will make you arrogant. And so how do you hold on to humility as you accumulate knowledge and create new ideas and theories?
That's beautiful. Thank you for all of that. And I grew up in Southern Oregon too, so actually like going down to the Bay Area was like always a nice getaway for me from
Mhm.
the opposite of going from the forests to the urban space, you know. But
Mhm.
yeah, cool. So, the first question I wanted to get into related to the book, was really just about the title itself. And you kind of talk about this in the early section of the book. You're examining a community and you're doing ethnographic work here. And, it can also be kind of an opportunity to talk a little bit about the book projects a little bit more broadly. But to get to this, I think it's particularly, important, especially for non-Muslim
Right.
listeners, to get to, what it is about Medina that is poignant to you and to Muslim people. So you write, I'm going to quote here, the conflicts that arose and were resolved in Medina, betrayal and expulsion, war and peace, hypocrisy and forgiveness, property relations and mutual aid, continue to inform contemporary Muslims in terms of what it means to live in relation at multiple scales as a servant of Allah and as a member of a socio-economic, spiritual, and political community, end quote. So say a little bit more about this and, then maybe take it a step out and talk about what Medina by the Bay means in relation to this understanding of Medina.
Yeah, thank you. So, when people think of Islam, the place that they tend to think of or the word that they know is Mecca, right? And so Mecca is the site of the Islamic pilgrimage, Hajj. It's the place where the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was from. And it was also the place he was exiled from when he first started to spread the message of Islam. So when the Prophet Muhammad is exiled from Mecca, he goes to Yathrib, which we now know is Medina. It is the place where his great grandmother Salma had been a great sort of matriarchal figure and leader. And it's basically a place where him and his community find refuge from the leadership of Mecca that feels quite threatened by the message of Islam and the following that the Prophet Muhammad is gaining in that moment. It's not the first place that Muslims go for refuge. A number of the community are sent to Abyssinia, where they are welcomed by the Christian king there. But at some point, the larger part of the community ends up going to Yathrib. And they really invite the Prophet there because he is so respected as a political figure, as a merchant. He is known to be very fair, very honest in his dealings. And they say, we are having internal struggles here. We would like you to come and help us resolve these conflicts. And so there are pagan communities there. There are Jewish communities there. And so they enter into covenants with each other, that they will provide protection and assistance to the refugee Muslims at the same time that the Muslims will also provide service and relationships to the people of Medina, right? And so there's a group of people called the Ansar, the helpers, who are those who welcome the Muslims into Medina. And so, also in Islam, we know that there are the verses that are revealed in Mecca and the verses that are revealed in Medina. And the verses that are revealed in Medina are really about sort of trying to create a new society. How do we relate with each other? How do we understand difference, right? How do we, like in the Quran, there's a much cited verse about, you were created in tribes, and I'm totally butchering it right now, but so that you could know each other, right? Different tribes, different people, so that you could know each other, right? And so there's this imperative of knowledge in relationship to difference, right? That difference isn't just this thing that happens. It is actually something that is a part of the challenge of humanity being in relationship to each other and what it means to understand each other or, maintain a certain level of opacity with each other, right? But that is a challenge and that's a responsibility. And so all of this starts to happen in Medina, right? But then also there's the betrayals and the expulsions. There are the moments of war and the moments of peace, where, people who you enter into covenant with break those covenants. right? Or make negotiations with those in power, right? And put people into vulnerable situations. At the same time, we're asking like, who gets, you know, the winnings of battles? How do we distribute things equitably, right? If someone can't go to a battle, how do we take care of the people, who weren't there to receive those things? So and I think that's the part around mutual aid as well, right? First, the initial welcoming into Refuge, but then also how do we support each other to create a society that is more equitable, right? How do we attend to the most vulnerable children, orphans, those who've been widowed, those who are traveling, right? Within Islam, there's a huge importance placed on those who are traveling, those who are vulnerable, and how you welcome them as a host and how you present yourself as a traveler, right? So I think these are all like wonderful lessons from the tradition that I'm trying to lift up because I think they actually have something to offer us in the contemporary moment.
Awesome. So say a little bit about how that then connects to the San Francisco, kind of Bay Area and the Medina by the Bay aspect of it.
Yeah. So as I mentioned in the book, it wasn't actually my idea. Like I took this from one of the students who in an Islamic history class is reflecting on what she's learned over the course of a year with Imam Zaid. And she says, this is kind of like our Medina. We get to come here and think about, who we are, become stronger in like our understanding of ourselves as Muslims so that we can go back out in the world and make a difference to that world. But like first we need to feel like we have a safe place to sort of incubate, right? And to learn. So I thought of this idea of this place, Medina, and thinking about it like Medina by the Bay was really a poetic way to understand what was happening in the Bay Area. So not only in Zaytuna, because even though that's where my ethnography started, when it came time to write the book, I really knew I wanted to tell a larger history of Islam in the Bay Area because Zaytuna didn't emerge out of nothing, right? It emerges out of a history that pre-existed it. And all of that to me was a part of what is this Medina by the Bay, this attempt by Muslims to create a new society, right? To reject the one that they have received, right? That they're born into or that they've moved to, and to present a new possibility, right? And then later through the course of my research, I learned that a community in East Oakland had actually created this idea of a new Medina. That's what they called their neighborhood around their mosque, right? So I think this is not something that originates with me. It is something that is, constantly like brought up by Muslims themselves in terms of we want to create, right? And I think one of the other things that I like about Medina versus Mecca is that the Mecca has a real connection to sort of power, whereas Medina is a place of refuge, right? And a place of creativity. And so I thought that was really important. And then later when I read Clyde Woods, when he talks about the US South as the Mecca, right, of Black culture and Black politics and Black thinking, epistemology, ontology, it totally made sense again in terms of the Bay Area because the Bay Area is infused with Southern language, tradition, thinking, people, of course. And so, I spent a lot of time, actually one of my jobs in college was working at a blues club, and so I got to know a little bit of the blues tradition in the Bay Area itself. But also, I got to hear stories about people and their families from Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, right? And how those, as I mentioned it in the book, I think that's kind of the Bay Area accent too. It's that combination of like the Southern, what Donna Murch calls the flat tongue, and then also like all the immigrant Englishes that then kind of merge together, right? So that there is a particular Bay Area accent, which I don't know if I have anymore because I haven't lived there for 20 years, but all of these things kind of contribute to this idea of Medina by the Bay.
Yeah, thank you. Now I'm thinking, what's Philly in this equation? Because Philly's definitely a big Muslim city too.
Definitely.
And also a site of, so many people that I meet in Philly their families are from South Carolina and like other, but yeah. So.
Right. No, for sure. There's no, claim. There's multiple Medinas for sure.
I'm mostly joking, but yeah.
Yes.
So one of the things that you bring up early in the text, and it comes up a few times, is this Muslim understanding that you, quote, share responsibility for the violence of the nation you live in, end quote. This stuck with me when I read it. From my own perspective, it's definitely something that resonates with me. Anti-imperialism for Josh and I is one of the kind of, in many ways, it's what we try to use as our guidepost of conversations that we have of like, we can talk to people who are abolitionist or anarchist politics or socialist or communist, but what's very important to us is that there's an anti-imperial, kind of viewpoint. And, obviously we live within, from our viewpoint, the empire, the U.S. empire. And so that's always been kind of really important to me. But that notion, this also stuck to me too, I think, in part because of the past 14 months and, actually talking to a lot of people, from Palestine or Lebanon or, reading tweets from folks from Yemen and other things is like that what you're talking about is something that is definitely a shared understanding across a lot of these folks that I didn't necessarily posit as an Islamic thing, necessarily when I first heard it. But it is very clear kind of articulation of like, just because you vote for this person or that person, or that you are still responsible, right? That you bear some responsibility for the things that your nation does. So anyways, I just wanted to share that was really interesting to read within the book. But what are some ways that this principle comes up in the book for you and some of the ways you've seen it kind of enacted that are moving to you?
Mm-hmm. I think in some ways it's not a total, like, I think actually Muslims would disagree, right, about this idea of the responsibility in terms of the violence of the nation we live in, right? And I think this is actually one of the major questions in Muslim communities in the United States in particular. Like, how do we respond to a state in which we have, to take the Medinan example, entered into covenant with through immigration, right? For those who have immigrated. And so then that's one set of things. And then there's the question of those who were kidnapped and brought here, right, to this place, who have their own sort of indigenous relationship to this place, right? And when I say indigenous, it is about this idea of indigeneity as a form of rebellion and a connection to this place, not necessarily about political claims in terms of the UN and indigeneity and indigenous struggle, right? We are all guests in one way or another, right? On Turtle Island. So it's one of the scholars who I'll talk about later, Mohammed Sharif, in one of the texts that he writes, he actually says that people who have emigrated, who have left Dar al-Islam for Dar al-Harb, the world of Islam for like the world of potential war, right? People who aren't Muslim, it means you've lost your credibility to have authority, like Islamic authority in that place, because you are not of that place and you've actually left a place in which you could practice Islam freely. And of course, that's also up for debate, right? In some ways, this has been the challenge, and this is what my book is pushing and arguing for, is that a lot of the Islamic ideas and concepts and things that people have agreed upon and have consensus about got consensus centuries ago in a very different world landscape, right? And that we have to also take this idea of creativity and apply it to the tradition, and to really work a lot harder to understand the tradition in our like contemporary circumstances, right? What are the specific contingencies in which we are trying to practice our faith? And then what does our faith then require of us, right? And so when the Quran says, if you have killed a soul, it's like you've killed an entire people, right? And if you have saved a soul, you have saved an entire people. That puts a certain responsibility on us in terms of what are the connections, what are the things that our lives enable elsewhere, and what does that mean in terms of the relationships we have with people elsewhere, right? Audre Lorde talks about this in terms of like, what have I done, to cause the diminishing of anyone I call my people, right? How do our lives in the belly of the beast, right, in the seat of empire, impact the people we call our brothers and sisters, right? Our kin. I mean, I think this last 14 months is like the worst, best example of that, right? The fact that the United States and Israel are like so tied existentially to each other, and that we're sitting here and pretending that we can live our lives, like everyday lives, in the midst of a genocide. And a genocide that has been called a genocide by multiple world bodies, right? This has been my like everyday struggle the last 14 months of like, how do I sit with myself and that responsibility at the same time that like I'm maintaining an everyday life, right? And like just trying to hold on and doing what I can, right? Because to me, actually, the proper response is that we stop, right? There was a moment, where there was something I saw where a Palestinian was like, we have, we've said all we could say, we've shown all we can show, and no one has done anything, right? Like, what else is there left? And then you see they say, "La hawla wala quwwata illa billah." There's no power, right, besides God. And that's so plainly seen here because the billions of other people in the world who have seen this have not been able to stop it, right? And I think we tend to maybe make some kind of sense of it by saying we can't do anything, right? That we don't bear that responsibility. But I think we have to start taking more responsibility, right? I have some thoughts about like how we do that, but it's also a matter of like what I think the last 20 years especially, but this is a much longer history, is like what has happened in terms of how people think about people in that region, right? In Palestine, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, Yemen, Syria, right? Like Iran, that has so diminished people's understanding of them as human beings, right? That we have enabled this to happen, right? Before our eyes, right? And like, I really don't understand how people in leadership can like sleep at night. Like the kind of melding and dehumanization you have to do to yourself to see what you see and still say that Israel has the right to defend itself, right? Like that is an exceptionality that is so beyond any other notion of like what people say when they say they value human life. This is a war of death, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how, there was another Palestinian who said, at that moment where they had saved a bunch of like, they'd, gone in and murdered a bunch of Palestinians to save a few Israeli hostages. He's like, if you ever have to kill hundreds of people to save me, leave me there. That's humanity, right? Like to recognize that your one life is in relationship to other lives and that your right to live is not greater than anyone else's right to live, right? That your right to self-defense isn't greater than someone else's right to live, right? And I think, James Baldwin said this too. He's like, I didn't, lynch anybody, but I still bear responsibility, right? And so I think this is something that I'm trying to awaken more in myself, as well as hopefully anyone who's listening or reading the book or thinking about these things. I think a lot of us are thinking about this. Like, what are we supposed to be doing? How do we respond? How do we mobilize more people to pay attention to this? Right? It's been a real struggle. Right. And to go back to this idea of like what I do with my filmmaking, and I think why I tend towards more experimental style is also because I know the work of the image. I know that the work of the image in terms of how people talk about Muslims, how people represent Muslims, it contributes to their dehumanization, right? Even when they present them in sort of quote unquote humanistic ways, it's still within a particular, regime of who counts and what makes you more human, what makes you more valuable. Right. There's a beautiful poem that I quote in my book. Right. So UK-based Suhaima Manzoor Khan, she writes this poem, and it's like an anti-humanizing Muslim poem, right? And so she's like, love us when we are lazy. Love us when we are poor. Love us high as kites, unemployed, joyriding, time-wasting, failing at school. Love us filthy. Love us silent, unapologizing, sometimes violent. When we are wretched, suicidal, naked, and contributing nothing, love us then, right? And she's sort of pushing against this idea of like, you need to recognize me as human, right? And I think that's one of the things that I'm trying to draw attention to. It's like the act of living in the United States is a dehumanizing process, right? Walking down the street, especially in the Bay Area right now, and seeing all the tents, right? Seeing the like extreme separation of wealth and poverty. Like you have to kill a little bit of your soul to be able to walk around every day, seeing that, right? And so like, what is the reparative work we have to do to like soften our hearts, right? To use like Islamic terminology, right? The Quran is full of references to our hearts being hardened and not being able to see, right? And I think that's also this impulse that I think I'm pushing in the book is like, what is the spiritual, and it doesn't have to be religious, but what is the work we have to do on our souls, on ourselves, our hearts, to keep us open and also to keep us like moving forward? What is the sabr that Palestinians have, right? This ability to like this enduring patience that keeps them moving forward and struggling for their liberation, right? We need that, right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for that. And I've felt many of those things that you're talking about in that commentary. And we're doing an interview with Andrew Crinks soon on his book. I think it's called White Property, Black Trespass. I hope I got that title right. But like he goes into the Christian religious function of mass incarceration, and it's fascinating. Like what made me think about it is you talking about the way that this stark thing between homeless people, also how do people reconcile what's going on in Gaza? How did they, and yeah, I don't want to give away too many things, but that book offers a lot of very, fascinating in a really kind of awful way, just crazy. Well, I don't want to use the word crazy, but just this deep religious, philosophical, basis for really, he's looking at it in terms of Western police power and incarceration and the religious function that they serve within a Christian ideological framework. And it's also all bound up with, Western notions of the nation state and everything else. But I think it offers some answers. For me, it's been helpful to why is dehumanization such an acceptable thing to so many people in the West? Now, that doesn't necessarily explain it for people who aren't of the West but are here now, because they don't necessarily share that epistemology. But I know part of what your book is looking at too, though, is that difficulty of, you're now in this place. And so then how do you orient yourself? Do you try to fit in with it, or do you try to make something different or build something different or struggle in a different kind of way? And Yeah. Anyway, I look forward to that discussion too, and I think
Yeah.
folks will find an interesting kind of resonance between those two books, your book and Andrew's. So another thing that you write about is, quote, how geography, cultural and socioeconomic forces and geopolitical agendas impact which Muslim ways of knowing and being become normative and dominant or marginalized and diminished, end quote. And this actually relates to what we were just talking about. So you look at this in the text with regards to U.S. empire's role, something I know we'll talk about a little bit more as this goes on. But can you talk a little bit about other examples of this that are interesting to you or that you look at in Medina by the Bay?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I think this is one of the main arguments of the book too, right? When people think about Islam or any kind of religion, they think of it as a vessel that arrives and, and it's just getting assimilated to American ways or something like that. And what I'm arguing is actually like the forms of Islam that emerge from the Bay Area or Philly, New York, Atlanta are very specific to the conditions in that place, right? The landscapes of that place, the geography of that place, who is there, the demographics, and the actual histories of that place. And then, of course, in addition to that, when does the state intervene in terms of narrating which forms of Islam are acceptable or quote unquote unsafe, right? Or insurgent. And so this comes up in a number of places in the book. I think one of the most clear examples is in that time period around September 11th when Sheikh Hamza Yusuf is at a fundraiser for Imam Jamil Al-Amin, formerly known as H. Rat Brown of SNCC and the Black Panther Party. And he is basically trying to raise funds for him and saying that the U.S. doesn't allow people to tell the truth about the United States, right? And it will bear responsibility for that kind of silencing and the work it does around the world. And then a couple of days later, September 11th happens, and Sheikh Hamza is invited to the White House as a Muslim advisor to President W. Bush at the time. This causes, some folks in the Muslim community are pretty upset by this. Like, what does it mean that he's being invited there? But to me, it says everything about the forms of Islam that are acceptable to the state and the forms that are not. So we see the U.S. government getting involved in sort of Islamic teaching, both domestically and internationally, right? And so we can see it in the actual support and creation of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan during the time period where the U.S. is going after the USSR during the Cold War, right? And so at that moment in Afghanistan, there is a leftist party in power. They are enacting all sorts of changes that the United States, like 20 years later, is going to be like, this is what we need to do for Afghan women. They were already doing it back then. But the U.S. at that time is funding landowners and imams to raise armies against the USSR, right? And that eventually becomes the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and all of these groups, ISIS and such. So in that moment, they are deciding that Islamism, quote unquote, is going to work for them, right? Against communism. At the same time, they're also like spreading these ideas around communism as the great evil amongst these different Muslim leaders around that part of the world, right? At the same time, in the 80s and 90s, they're targeting Black-led Muslim communities, the leadership in particular, by, trumping up cases against them, putting them under surveillance. There's one section in the book where I talk about around 1999, there's a meeting that Imam Jamil holds with a number of other leaders in Muslim communities at the multiple Medinas across the country. And they're trying to become a federation, right? To organize a kind of Muslim plan in the United States. And of those leaders, one of them is currently incarcerated, Imam Jamil, trying to fight in appeals to get out of prison. Imam Luqman was murdered in Detroit, and Sheikh Mohammed Sharif was exiled after the intense surveillance of his community. In the case of Muhammad Sharif, part of his exile was also around the teaching he was doing in the California prison system as a Muslim chaplain. He was working in Solano and Vacaville, and there were already Muslims pulling up cases against the DOC there about, their rights to halal food, their rights to congregate for Friday prayers and things like that. Garrett Felber has a really great book, Those Who Know Don't Say, about especially the Nation of Islam's work of litigation in U.S. penitentiaries, and also this dialectic of discipline in terms of like the discipline needed amongst the Muslims to fight the fight, but then also how the state responds with its own dialectic of discipline. And we see this in the case of Sheikh Mohammed Sharif, where they accuse him of like riling up the Muslim prisoners and pushing them to make these cases that they were already making, right? He was just bringing more of the like Islamic legal points of view to help them make their cases. But he gets targeted for this, right? And so these leaders are constantly taken from the community and then dictate sort of which Muslim communities then survive and which ideas of Muslim community flourish, which ascend, which ones get more property, get more attendees at their mosques, which ones lose their mosques, right? So another story I tell in the book is about a community around Fruitvale, right, who in the 1980s was able to purchase a huge former Catholic school where they had a mosque and a really important educational institution, one of the Clara Muhammad schools that provided elementary education for the children, not only of the Muslim community, but throughout the neighborhood. During the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis, they lost that building, right? They had bought it outright, right? But the cost of maintaining that building, as well as, targeting what was really prime real estate, right? I'm sure the terms of the loan were not, like the money that they took out to maintain the building were not good. They lost that building, right? At the same time that Silicon Valley mosque communities were doubling in size, acquiring more property at the same time that Zaytuna College was getting millions of dollars of property in the Berkeley Hills to expand their campus, right? Part of the reason why this particular community also lost their buildings was because of gentrification, right? When your community is getting gentrified, that means people are being pushed to the outskirts of the Bay Area. They can't come to mosque, right? They can't make their 5 daily prayers, let alone the weekly Friday prayer, right? They can't foment the kind of energy that a community needs to thrive and support itself. And again, that comes back to these questions of mutual aid. And this mosque continues actually, even with their diminished capacity to provide mutual aid to the local community. But it's not that their Islam was bad, right? It was the actual geopolitics of the area, right? These other elements that have to do, not, and also including like certain like racist ideas within the Muslim community, right? About who has religious authority, right? In a particular region. So I think these are parts of the contingencies of which forms of Islam survive or don't, right? Some of our greatest Muslim thinkers are incarcerated as political prisoners here, right? This isn't exclusive to, the US, right? This happens around the world, right? So even in Muslim majority countries, we see this, right? Which forms of Islam are state sanctioned? Which are incarcerated, which are murdered, which are expelled, which are sent to the, Guantanamo, right? Like we have very clear ideas about how this happens. And I think a lot of times in Muslim community, there's also this idea that if a particular school of law, Muslim law, is in ascension, it's somehow like blessed, right? But I think we have to be really honest about what is state sanctioned and what sort of is of the people, right?
Yeah, appreciate that. And just with regards to Garrett Felber, we do have a episode with Garrett on that book, so I'll link that in the show description as well. You kind of alluded to some of this But, I really appreciate the ways that you draw on different legacies of African and, for lack of a better term, Black Muslims, although I understand, Garrett talks about this and you kind of alluded to it well. It's that itself is a fraught term, of course, because it's like trying to sort of delineate a separateness from Islam in a way that it shouldn't be, right? Necessarily.
Yeah.
But, you're thinking in the book, both with histories of Islam in Africa, including in West Africa, which of course then, you know, does survive the Middle Passage into enslaved communities, as different people have written about, thinking about the role of Islam within, maroon communities and enslaved communities, and with regard to, even like rebellions and insurrections and things like this. And then later, in the 20th century, and I'm always interested in the kind of, also, it's not something that you dig into in the book, but the kind of discontinuity. Although you do talk about how, I can't remember the name of the scholar that you cite, but there's a discussion about how at a certain point with enslaved people, because slavery was so disruptive to family structures, that it just became very, very difficult for Islamic knowledge to be passed on in a kind of continuous thing. So anyway, like looking then, you also look at obviously the Nation of Islam, who are often excluded or marginalized for various reasons from histories of Islam on Turtle Island, some of which have to do with different systems of belief and things like this too. But one of the things that you discuss is this concept of dawah, and how Malcolm X, or as you mentioned earlier, you refer to him rightly as El-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, and Elijah Muhammad both play this role of reviving Islam in the United States. And then to add a little bit more onto it, as you talked about some of the brilliant incarcerated Muslim thinkers in the United States, there is this very direct line, which we've talked to some of the people, whether it's Daruba Ben Wahad or whether it's Sekou Odinga, may rest in peace, of people who had this connection. In Sekou's case, it was actually direct because he was a part of the organizations that Malcolm founded after leaving the nation, but of this connection between Malcolm X and then many of the Panthers, especially on the East Coast, but not exclusively, and, the Black Liberation Army as well. Many of those folks are Muslim, Jalil Muntakim. And you talk about these legacies throughout the book. They're kind of weaved in, Speak a little bit about the kind of importance of these histories in examining Islam in a place like the Bay Area or the so-called U.S. more broadly.
Yeah, I think the author I cited was Sylviane Diouf, perhaps, her book Servants of Allah, which talks about the ways that Muslims maintained their Muslim identity, beliefs, practices during the period of enslavement. And actually, there's more and more research that, people are doing, and people are speaking out about the fact that there were Muslims who survived, right, who managed to transmit the tradition to their descendants, right? And so there are continuities from that time period, right? So for those folks who don't know, it is estimated that 10 to 30% of enslaved Africans were Muslim, right? The region that they came from in West Africa means that a lot of them brought that with them, right? And we also have, the texts of different scholars who were kidnapped and brought here, who are writing in Arabic. And there's probably also a lot of underground maintenance of the tradition that happened at that time, especially when people were expected to become Christian, right? And so I think that's really important. But I think what also is really important about that history is the role of Muslims in the rebellions that happened during that time period, right? And the consciousness that they brought with them that remains. In terms of El-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz and the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, they see in Islam, right, something that is both part of their sort of ancestry, perhaps, maybe not direct, but something that is African that can be a positive force in Black communities, right? And the work that they did in terms of reviving Islam. And so that is also a terminology in Islam, that in a belief that every 100 years there are those who will revive Islam, right? Return the community back to the original teachings, right? To bring forth a sort of quote unquote true Islam after, decades of corruption, which we as humans are quite susceptible to. And so this isn't some like Islamic scholarly assessment, though I've heard reference to it, but I will stake a claim that I think they are revivers of Islam, right? Especially Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz through his work of dawah, right? Which is the invitation, the call to Islam. And it's a call to Islam not only to non-Muslims, but it's a call to Muslims themselves to renew their relationship to Islam. The fact that he continues to convert people to Islam or revert people to Islam even after his passing, right, speaks to his position as a wali, right, which is badly translated as saint, but someone who has a position with Allah due to his work of reviving Islam and spreading the message. So like for me, Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz is really an important ancestor in terms of how I think about being Muslim on Turtle Island, right? In terms of, the anti-imperialist stance he took. I don't know if I answered that question fully, right? But that was always his position, especially after his international travels, right? That this was a global struggle, that we wouldn't get anywhere here unless we took our struggle internationally, right? And that is a huge threat, right, to the so-called United States, right, to sort of claim that it has no authority over us as a minority population here, right? And so I think those histories for me are really important. Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz came to the Bay Area a few times, right? So it was important for me to kind of chart some of that history. The fact that groups like the Afro-American Association, that really important reading group that, leads Huey and Bobby to start the Black Panther Party, right? They were also reading the Quran, right? They were reading al-Shabazz. They were students of that history, right? I think, I can't remember both of them, but at least one of them attended Nation of Islam meetings too, right? Like they were trying to scope it all out to figure out like what was the plan, right? That they needed to put forward. So that is an important part of the, Black Panther legacy, right? That these Muslim ideas were also a part of what becomes actually like Black student associations, right? The Black Panther Party, these really like what can be in some cases couched as like Black nationalists, right? Have these Islamic traces in them, right? And also this idea of Black nationalism being put on the Nation of Islam, right? That it was somehow exclusionary, that it was not for other people, right? So I tell an important story in the book about an indigenous person and a Latinx person, Muslim, who becomes Muslim through the nation, right? Imam Ibrahim, right? That had to be discussed amongst the nation, but they were like, of course, this indigenous brother should be welcomed into the nation, right? That's what this is for, right? That this is a counter culture, right? This is a counter position, a counter politics to what the so-called United States was presenting as sort of an ideal beacon of humanity and democracy, right? That contradiction was so plain, right, to al-Shabazz and others that informed how they understood Islam and how they taught and mobilized it for their people, right? And I think that then has traces in the different institutions that emerge in the Bay Area later, right? The different mosque communities, the Dar al-Islam, which travels from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast and throughout, and a number of other different Muslim movements that scholars are finally kind of getting to, but that community members have known about all this time. And so in some ways, like, this is also my interpretive work, right? Going from an ethnographic study of one particular institution to expand it to a larger history, to say there are different paths we can follow, right? There are different possibilities at the same time, when we follow those possibilities, let's be clear that the state will pay attention, right? And how do we, maintain our communities, develop our communities, both internally and materially, to sustain themselves through that struggle, right?
Just quickly, is the thing you talk about in the book too of a period, I think you said in the 1970s maybe, but where a number of people leave the nation and become Sunni? Or could you just say a little bit about that history?
Yeah.
Like what happened?
Yeah, so in 1975, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad passes away, and his son, Imam Warithdin Muhammad, comes into leadership of the Nation of Islam. And so Elijah Muhammad and Claire Muhammad sent a number of their children to the Middle East and also, I think, Africa to study Islam, right? Sort of quote unquote traditional orthodoxy Islam. So even though the teachings of the nation weren't the same as the sort of orthodox Islamic teachings, they had a consciousness of it. And for a lot of people say this was part of the conceptualization, that you bring people in with the particular ideas that the nation had. But the idea was that through generational transfer, that Muslims, the nation of Islam Muslims, would join the larger global community of Muslims. And so this is sort of what happens in 1975. Imam Warithdin, sort of what's called the transition, brings the community into a Sunni Islam. Not everyone goes with him, right? But a large part of the community does, right? And then, Farrakhan later reasserts, tries to bring back the nation. And so that's why we still have the nation today, right? With more of the sort of ideas that the nation carries forward. So the transition happens, and this goes back to this idea of reviving, right? This is a huge, communal conversion into Islam, the likes of which we don't really see in the 20th century, let alone maybe the last 500 years, right? It's a voluntary conversion to Islam, right? And it brings a huge force and a huge knowledge base with it, right? And I think this is one of the points I keep trying to make, is that this knowledge base has been by non-Black Muslims and even Black Muslims themselves discredited, right? That somehow they're not bringing an authentic Islam with them in that transition. Whereas to me, it's an absolutely authentic Islam that comes from the contingencies and the context of this place, right? What people need to survive this place as a community, what Islam needs to survive this place as an idea, as a way of being, as a way of knowing. And so that happens in the 1970s. And so a lot of the Black Muslim communities, or the Black-led Muslim communities that we see throughout so-called United States, are from that transition, but not all of them, right? There were a lot of communities, including the Dar al-Islam community, the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood, and others that emerged from other sort of genealogies, right? And I think that's also really important to acknowledge. But one of the things that my book is trying to also intervene in is the fact that a recent study by one of the Muslim institutes showed that the number of Black-led mosques is diminishing right now. So what I articulate in the history of the Bay Area is not unique to the Bay Area, right? That Muslim spaces as a whole are increasing in the United States, but Black-led spaces are decreasing, right? And this is a huge problem, right? It's in a state of emergency for me and for others who think the way I do, because of that history and knowledge and that spiritual strength, right? To put it frankly, too, and that political positioning, right? That comes with generational knowledge of what this place is, right? And so I think that's one of the really important reasons why I bring in that legacy. This is our legacy, and this is the legacy of survival and how Islam should be mobilized towards that survival. right? This wasn't an appeal to the most elite in our society to become Muslim. This was an appeal to the most vulnerable, right? The most disenfranchised in our society. And I think that says a lot about what the potential future of Islam in this place is if we forget that.
Yeah, thank you. One of the people that weaves through your book quite a bit is Haja Rashida. And so you talk about her as a mentor in certain ways. What are some of the things that stand out to you about her work and her legacy? I know that she's one of the figures that's not from Zaytuna, and so, represents some different genealogies within the Bay. But yeah, go ahead.
Mm-hmm. I think it's okay for me to not use her pseudonym in the context of this interview. So Haja Damira Ahmed, who I've written a piece about her in the book Black Panther Afterlives on Haymarket Press book. She's the person I dedicate my book to. She was a Black Catholic schoolgirl in San Francisco, born in 1950, who joined the Black Panther Party while she was still in high school. She's recruited to San Francisco State to be a part of the emergence of the Black Student Union there and the Third World Liberation Front. So she's a big part of that. She joins the Nation of Islam, sort of initially instrumentally, because she felt like she just needed to work for Black people. And she went through the split between the East and West Coast Black Panther Party, was really traumatized by that, and then becomes like an incredibly devout Muslim woman. And she was introduced to Islam actually through her interactions with the New York Muslims in the Black Panther Party in New York. She was able to go there while she was at SF State and get to know them. And I think that really shaped her understanding of what the Black Panther Party was supposed to be doing, but that also what the Muslim community was supposed to be doing, right? And so she took that into her work. She became a teacher and then later a principal at an Oakland public school, and then was also a big part of starting a charter school in Oakland. I got to know her through my research, but we also had all these connections as folks who went to or who grew up in San Francisco. I went to the Jesuit high school that her brother went to. I was in the third class of girls there. She and her mom worked at the shopping mall where I spent a lot of my time. She grew up not very far from where I grew up, but I met her at a mosque in Oakland through my research. And she was the person actually that pushed me to think more about the history of Islam in the Bay Area. I gave a talk at Zaytuna College during the course of my field work there, and I invited her to come, and she came, and she gave me really great feedback about the prehistory of Zaytuna Institute, but also the prehistory that led to a Yemeni scholar, Habib Omar, to do a tour of North America, that he wouldn't have done this tour of North America without having had students from Oakland, from San Francisco, from New York, Detroit, elsewhere, who had gone to Yemen and studied with him and said, you need to come to where we're from, right? So she helped me understand the influence of what was happening in the Bay Area globally as well, but also that really important history. And so she was somebody for me who had no qualms about trying to distinguish between religion and politics, right? Like for her, there was no contradiction. She had been a card-carrying member of the Black Panther Party. She knew Mao really well, right? She had read Fanon, but she was also extremely devout in terms of how she approached her Islam. And I think one of the things that I learned later after she passed away was how it was really important for her in terms of thinking about what it took to sustain a community and herself for the long struggle, right? Having been through the ravages of the 1970s, the early 1970s, in particular in the Bay Area and the politics, she knew that the state was not going to abide by people disproving its legitimacy, right? That the Black Panther Party was providing food, education, housing, medical care, right? Doing the things that the state was supposed to be doing in a way that delegitimized its authority and power, right? And its status in Black communities. And I think that was a really important lesson in terms of like what we're supposed to be doing to bring people into our movements, right? To get people to recognize that we're not just a bunch of like talkers, right? That we're actually doing stuff, that we're providing folks with what they need on a day-to-day basis while also activating what they already know, right? In terms of the inherent contradictions and injustice of the system in which we live, right? So it's just about activating it and mobilizing it, right? Another thing that she taught me, and this is something that I didn't hear the first time, and like I'm so thankful I recorded my interviews with her because it was later in listening where I was like, oh, she was poking at me here, right? She was like, we could have gone on to get PhDs, like we could have gone and taken the scholarly route, the more established route, but we didn't. Right? We chose to be with the people and to sacrifice to some way. We could have had easier lives, but we made the strategic decision, but also the extremely like heartfelt decision to be in our communities and take risks for our communities. Right? And I think that's something that I'm constantly like thinking about, right? What are the risks? What are we willing to lose in this struggle if we're really about what we say we're about, right? And I think this was one of the really important lessons that I learned from her as well, right? Like that this is a long struggle and that you can't necessarily come out of it unscathed. And if you're trying to come out of it unscathed, then are you really in it and how effective is it going to be? Or are you just going to be co-opted, right? And so I think that was also a really important lesson. I think one thing I also want to mention is that one of the issues around ethnography that merges into history is this issue of pseudonyms, right? And I only can write about her because she passed in the process of writing. I don't think I would have felt comfortable writing about her history because, as she and others say in the book, the state does not forget, right? And that in the fact in 2008 that the state uses new laws that emerge from a post 9/11, security state to go back to cases from the 1970s against the Black Liberation Army is testament that they do not forget. And so that we have to be attentive to what we can say, right? At the same time, though, I want her to get her flowers. I want people to know her name. Right? Which is why I'm saying her name right now. And I think that's important. And I think there are actually some scholars who are kind of learning about her, mostly I guess through my work, and wanting to write about her as a really important ancestor in this work that we're doing and trying to, make change and build a better place and a better world. Yeah. Another really important thing that I learned from Sister Demira was her commitment to our political prisoners. She spent a lot of time answering the phone, going to visit Sekou and others in prison, right? She and Yuri Kochiyama had a relationship when Yuri moved back to the Bay Area, right? She would always bring Yuri stamps so that Yuri could write her letters, right? And this is something I also learned from Demira, and I think it really mobilized my work that maybe we'll talk about a little later in terms of Believers Bailout and the work I do around incarcerated Muslims as well. So I just wanted to mention that as well.
Yeah, awesome. And you mentioned it, but, you bring your different crafts to this book. There are scenes that basically are like screenplay scenes within the book. And then there's like a couple sections that are these brief sections that are kind of like montages. So you have this one that's called rewind, historical interlude, make your own montage, Cold War, drug war, war on terror. And it starts, quote, in a document produced to reflect on the time in the United States prior to exile, Muslim scholar Sheikh Mohammed Sharif connects American neo-imperial covert action in Nicaragua and Afghanistan to demonstrate how the CIA and the U.S. government more broadly impacted what forms of Islam flourished throughout the 1980s, while also enabling the flow of drugs into American cities, end quote. So talk a little bit about this section and, kind of the document or the history that you're referencing here.
Yeah, I think the rewind part is, of course, referencing to DJing and let's bring that record back, right? And I think this was one of the challenges throughout the book of how to bring a lot of different times and places together in a way that made sense to me in the field, but that are harder to convey in writing, right? And so that's how I developed the screenplay format, right? Because in film, you can sort of cinematically montage, edit, put together different places and times that will then, through their juxtaposition, open up a new idea, right? Or a new way of thinking, right? To bring these different things into relation. And I think that also goes back to this idea of how do we understand our positionality, right? In the seat of empire in terms of what happens elsewhere in the world, right? To think about these on a continuous plane rather than as something that's wholly separate. And I think this interlude in particular really makes sense of that. It is a document by Sheikh Mohammed Sharif, who I've mentioned earlier. He had founded this organization, Sankore, the Institute of Islamic African Studies International. And this is a text called The Decisive Solution that someone from the community shared with me when I started to think about the book. And so Mohammed Sharif is a person I mentioned earlier who had been a part of that meeting in Atlanta with Imam Jamil and others. He had also spent a number of years in the Bay Area in the 1990s where he was a Muslim chaplain at Solano and Vacaville. And he, through that work in particular, was then targeted by the state. And also through his work in getting Muslims to start thinking about themselves as a minority in the United States that could appeal to the United Nations with a particular kind of minority status that would give them some autonomy here. And so that sort of international connection, right, like El-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz really put a target on his back. So in The Decisive Solution, he writes about his time in the so-called United States and what led to his exile, but also his plan for what Muslim communities should be doing. And so he had grown up in Connecticut, was the son of members of the Nation of Islam. So in that 1975 transition, they also make that transition. And he, at the beginning of sort of what becomes the state-sanctioned, right, destruction of African-American communities through the influx of guns and drugs, he is actually sent to Africa to study Islam. And when he comes back in 1990, he sees the ravages on Black communities that has happened. And so there's a section in his paper where he talks about the history of the Cold War that I mentioned earlier, especially in terms of the training of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, its relationship to the Contras in Nicaragua. And some of my first memories are of the Oliver North trials. Those are the things I remember when I think of my childhood. That was on the news, right?
Me too.
Iran-Contra affair. Yeah. And so he talks about that history, right? If we connect the Iran-Contra affair, what's happening with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, the spreading of an anti-communist messaging amongst different Muslim movements throughout South Asia and the Middle East and elsewhere. And also, again, funded by Saudi Arabia and, in the relationship that the U.S. and Saudi Arabia have with each other, right? We start to see these connections of the The folks who were in the Taliban were actually putting taxes on the opioids, right, that were being grown in Afghanistan, which made it more expensive for, drug smugglers. So that was also a part of going after the Taliban, right? That the influx of drugs that was state sanctioned had to break down, the Black communities, in particular the insurgent movements that emerged here in the 1960s and 70s, that also then has this U.S. empire relationship, right? So then we can see like what people were talking about as internal colonized peoples is directly related to colonized peoples elsewhere, and also not that direct colonization, but that sort of neo-imperial relationships in terms of what was happening in the Cold War. Right. And the way that the U.S. dismantled democratic movements across the world, right? The work it does in the 1950s from Iran to Chile elsewhere, right? So leading from the Cold War, the drug war to the war on terror, we see a through line, right? And this is what my counterinsurgent continuities chapter is talking about, that these are through lines that we have to see in relationship with each other to have a good analysis of what has happened and what needs to happen in our thinking and in our practices as people who want to see change in the world and who want to, sustain our communities, right? How are we thinking about the relationships between Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States in that time period? Because Israel was also involved in that stuff, right? In relationship to now, right? Thinking about Israel's relationship to South Africa during apartheid. Right? We need to know that history to understand how Israel understands apartheid and legitimizes it, even if it maybe doesn't say that, right, up front. Although actually a lot of them do say it up front, right? That they are not afraid to talk about ethnic cleansing because they've been given license by the United States, right? So I think I wanted to foreground Muhammad Sharif's text also in terms of thinking about how we understand Muslim life in the so-called United States, right? In terms of people's aspirations for a kind of redemption for immigration, right? I think immigration, people don't talk about the violence of that experience, right? But part of the leaving of one's home, one's language, one's culture, it is a painful experience. And then to make life here, there needs to be some redemptive value to it, right? And that has been a huge part of the messaging in a lot of Muslim communities, right? That completely discounts the history of what the United States has done both here and elsewhere, right? There's a reason people end up here, right? And so I think through montage, right, I'm hoping to bring these different things together, that they are not isolated things, right? The kinds of Islam that emerges here, the forms of Islam and institutions and peoples that survive here is not an accident, right? That they have particular contingencies, and it's only by sort of understanding how these different histories relate to each other and the work of the state and geopolitics that we have a better sense of the reality in which we are in.
Right on. Following on that same point, you do also, I think it's in the section right after that, connect the legacy of COINTELPRO and related, domestic, I put that in air quotes, but thinking about also the ways that Orasami Burton talks about domestic war and domestic counterinsurgency and the so-called, war on terror to the structures of, anti-radical policing in the Bay Area, obviously everywhere, but you're looking at because that's the area you're looking at the most. And there's really important through lines of policing of Islam, anti-Muslim policing. And so talk a little bit about that, about how you kind of trace that through line and some of the connections that you see, and maybe also just a bit about, why you think that is. What is it so much about Islam or Muslims that attracts that kind of state attention, in your opinion?
I think That last part is a question I've been thinking about a lot, and perhaps it'll go into a little bit of our conversation around 1492 and the earlier histories. And this also makes me think of the text you mentioned earlier in terms of thinking about property, right? And I was also thinking about Cheryl Harris's work on whiteness as property, and then Nora Ericott's, taking of that in the context of occupied Palestine. I think Islam has very clear ideas around economy, social life, relationships, power, authority that have been subjugated both by Western powers, but also by leadership in Muslim majority countries as well, right? If you look at the work of what secularization did in places that we tend to think of as Islamic countries like Egypt, for example, Iran and other places, what parts of Islam get applied to law and which are sort of relegated, right? So, in most places, Islam gets applied to things having to do with the domestic sphere, the private sphere, right? But anything that Islam has to say about the economy, right, and power relations is put off to the side, right? So that was intentional.
Bye.